On a warm June morning in 1929, the silence at Virginia Beach's most elegant hotel shattered with a sound no one would ever forget. A scream pierced through the salt air as a hotel worker discovered something terrible on the concrete patio below the 6th floor. The crushed body of an 82-year-old man lay motionless, his journey from the window above ending in an instant that would raise questions for generations. That man was Adolf Coors, the immigrant who built one of America's greatest brewing empires. And the mystery of what happened in that hotel room would be swept away almost as quickly as his life had ended. The morning had started peacefully enough. Guests were beginning to stir in their rooms at the Cavalier Hotel, that magnificent 7-story brick palace that had opened just 2 years earlier to national acclaim. The hotel had been designed by the architectural firm Neff and Thompson with a distinctive Y-shaped floor plan, ensuring that most of its rooms featured sweeping views of the Atlantic Ocean. Every guest enjoyed the luxury of a private bathroom, still uncommon in 1927. The building itself was a marvel, constructed with over 500,000 bricks, the most ever used on a single building in Virginia. Its sunken gardens produced fresh flowers that decorated the halls and dining rooms. Some of the bathtubs even featured special handles that allowed guests to run seawater baths, while sinks offered ice water taps that drew from a giant ice-filled reservoir on the roof. But to understand why a man who had everything might stand at a window overlooking the Atlantic Ocean and step into emptiness, we must go back to the beginning. Back to a cold day in February, the 4th day of 1847, when a baby boy was born in Barmen, Prussia, a city nestled in the Rhine region that would later become part of Wuppertal, Germany. His parents, Joseph and Helena Coors, were simple working people with modest dreams for their son. Joseph worked as a master miller, supervising mill operations, while Helena managed their humble household. They couldn't have imagined that the infant they named Adolf would one day build a fortune in a land they would never see. They couldn't have known that the boy sleeping in their modest home would become one of the wealthiest men in America, or that his wealth would bring him no peace. When Adolf was just a year old, the family moved to Dortmund, where Joseph had found better work prospects. It was a city of industry and ambition, where the smell of coal smoke mixed with the scent of bread from the bakeries and beer from the breweries. The Coors family lived across the street from the Wenker Brewery, and young Adolf would watch the workers coming and going, smell the sweet aroma of malted barley, and hear the sounds of barrels being rolled across cobblestone streets. He couldn't have known then that this brewery would shape his entire future. Young Adolf grew up across the street from a brewery, and the smell of hops and barley became as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. At age 14, he began working as an apprentice at the Wenker Brewery, learning the ancient craft of turning grain and water into golden beer. He was a natural, with a nose for quality and hands that seemed to understand the delicate dance of fermentation. But tragedy arrived before his craft could fully bloom. In April of 1862, his mother Helena died. Just 8 months later, his father Joseph followed her into the ground. At 15 years old, Adolf Coors was an orphan. The brewery became more than his workplace. It became his salvation. While his younger siblings were sent to a Catholic orphanage, Adolf remained at the brewery, working as a bookkeeper to pay for the apprenticeship that kept him fed and sheltered. He threw himself into learning everything about beer, from the chemistry of the brewing process to the business of selling it. The orphan boy grew into a skilled young man, moving from brewery to brewery across Germany, always perfecting his craft, always dreaming of something more. In 1868, at 21 years old, Adolf made a decision that would change everything. He would go to America. But there was one problem. The passage across the Atlantic cost about 100 marks, more money than he had ever possessed. So Adolf did what desperate young men sometimes do. He snuck aboard a ship in Hamburg, hiding in the dark belly of the vessel as it pulled away from the only home he had ever known. When he was discovered mid-voyage, the captain gave him a choice: work off his debt in America or be thrown overboard. Adolf chose life. When the ship docked in Baltimore, Adolf stepped onto American soil with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning shame about how he had arrived. For the rest of his life, he would forbid his family from ever speaking about his journey as a stowaway. It was a secret that would remain buried until 1970, 41 years after his death. But first, he had to survive. America in the late 1800s was a land of brutal opportunity. Adolf worked as a bricklayer, a stonecutter, a fireman, anything that paid. He dug canals in Chicago until his hands bled. He hauled coal until his back screamed. Every dollar he earned brought him one step closer to his dream. And his dream was simple. He would brew the finest beer in America. In 1872, after years of grinding labor, Adolf made his way to Denver, Colorado. The city was growing, the mountain air was clean, and most importantly, Clear Creek ran cold and pure through nearby Golden. For a brewer, that water was liquid gold. He worked as a gardener and managed a bottling plant, saving every penny, planning every move. By November of 1873, he had scraped together $2,000. He found a partner named Jacob Schuler, who had $18,000 to invest, and together they bought an abandoned tannery in Golden. The Golden Brewery was born, and Adolf poured every ounce of his skill into making beer that tasted like the old country. He refused to cut corners. He insisted on the finest ingredients. He treated his employees better than most brewers, giving them breaks and decent wages because he remembered what it felt like to work until you couldn't stand. By 1880, his beer was so good that Schuler agreed to sell his share. Adolf Coors, the orphan stowaway, became the sole owner of what would become one of the largest breweries in the world. But success didn't soften the hard edges inside him. Those who knew Adolf described him as cold, taciturn, deeply unpleasant. At Sunday family dinners, barely a word was spoken. When 2 of his infant children died, he buried them in unmarked graves, as if refusing to acknowledge the loss could make it hurt less. He had no hobbies, no interest in sports, no friendships outside of business. He built an empire, but inside the fortress of his wealth, he was profoundly alone. In April of 1879, Adolf married Louisa Weber, the daughter of a railroad superintendent who worked for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. They were married at the Coors home on the brewery grounds, a modest ceremony that reflected Adolf's practical nature. Louisa was 21 years old, cultured and kind, with dreams of building a proper family life. Together they would have 8 children, though only 6 would survive to adulthood. 3 sons would carry the Coors name into the future. Adolf Jr., born on January 12, 1884. Grover Cleveland Coors, born in 1888. And Herman Frederick Coors, who arrived on July 24, 1890, while the family was vacationing in Berlin. The 3 daughters brought different energy to the household. Louise, nicknamed Lulu, was born on March 2, 1880. Augusta, called Gussie by her friends, came in 1881, and Bertha, born on June 24, 1886, would grow up to become an accomplished equestrienne and safari hunter, traveling to places her father never dreamed of seeing. As his family grew, so did his fortune. Beer sales climbed year after year. The quality of Coors beer became legendary across Colorado and the territories beyond. And in 1890, Adolf decided to build something that would show the world he had arrived. A mansion worthy of a brewing king, a statement in brick and wood that said the stowaway orphan had conquered America. The house rose on the brewery grounds in Golden, positioned carefully so that Adolf could walk from his business to his home in minutes, never letting the empire out of his sight. It was constructed partly from pieces of an old dance pavilion and beer garden that had once operated on the property, structures that had brought joy to workers and families on warm summer evenings, but had stood empty for years. Adolf saw opportunity in those old buildings. He salvaged the best timber, the strongest beams, and incorporated them into something entirely new, just as he had rebuilt himself from the fragments of his orphaned childhood. The mansion was a Victorian masterpiece, reflecting the architectural style that dominated American taste in the late 19th century. Its exterior featured the ornate details that characterized the era. Decorative trim adorned the eaves. Bay windows jutted out to capture the Colorado sunshine from multiple angles. A wraparound porch invited family members to sit and watch the world go by, though Adolf himself rarely sat still. The house had 22 rooms spread across multiple floors, each space designed with purpose and filled with meaning. The entrance hall set the tone for everything that followed. Polished oak panels lined the walls, their grain carefully matched and their finish glowing with the warmth of natural wood. Visitors stepping inside would first notice the staircase, a grand curved structure that rose to the upper floors with hand-carved balustrades and newel posts topped with finials shaped like acorns, symbols of strength and endurance. Adolf chose these details himself, understanding that every element of a house tells a story about the people who live there. The library became Adolf's sanctuary, the one room where the cold, taciturn man might have felt something approaching peace. Floor-to-ceiling shelves held hundreds of books, most of them written in German by authors from his homeland. Here were the works of Goethe and Schiller, volumes of German history and philosophy, technical texts on brewing and business. He had left Prussia as an uneducated stowaway, but in America he had educated himself, spending late nights reading by lamplight, absorbing knowledge like his beer absorbed the flavors of hops and malt. The library also contained a heavy desk where he reviewed brewery accounts and signed papers, always insisting on understanding every detail of his business. Oriental rugs covered many of the floors throughout the house, their intricate patterns and rich colors imported from Persia and Turkey at considerable expense. These weren't merely decorations. They were proof that a boy who once dug canals until his hands bled could now afford the finest textiles in the world. The rugs muffled footsteps and added warmth to rooms that might otherwise have felt cold, despite the Colorado sunshine streaming through the windows. In the main parlor, a massive chandelier imported from Copenhagen hung from a ceiling adorned with decorative plasterwork. The chandelier held dozens of candles, later replaced with electric bulbs when electricity came to Golden, and its crystal prisms caught the light and scattered rainbows across the walls. Beneath this glittering fixture, the family would gather for formal occasions, though gathering rarely meant warmth. At Sunday dinners, Adolf presided over the table with stern silence, expecting his children to eat quietly and behave with perfect decorum. Barely a word was spoken at these meals. The clinking of silverware on china, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the occasional cough or cleared throat were the only sounds in a room that should have been filled with conversation and laughter. The music room held a Steinway piano, a magnificent instrument with ivory keys and rich, resonant tone. It had been shipped from New York at enormous cost, transported carefully across the plains to avoid damage. Louisa played occasionally, filling the house with Beethoven and Mozart, pieces she had learned as a girl. The children took lessons, though whether Adolf ever sat and listened, whether music ever softened something inside him, the historical record doesn't say. The piano waited in that room like a question that was never quite answered. Adolf's favorite easy chair sat in a smaller sitting room, positioned near a round table with a concealed radio, one of the first in golden. This was a marvel of modern technology, allowing him to hear voices and music from far away without leaving his home. He would sit there in the evenings after the brewery had gone quiet, the radio playing softly, his face unreadable, his thoughts known only to himself. Did he think about the parents he had lost? Did he remember the cold belly of the ship that brought him to America? Did he ever feel satisfied with what he had built? Or was he always reaching for something just beyond his grasp? The bedrooms on the upper floors were appointed with care. Each child had their own space, furnished with beds and wardrobes, washstands and mirrors. The master bedroom that Adolf shared with Louisa featured a 4-poster bed with a heavy carved headboard, windows that looked out over the brewery grounds, and a private dressing area. Here, in the early morning hours, Adolf would rise before dawn, dress in his practical business clothes, and prepare for another day of overseeing his empire. The mansion stood as Adolf's gift to Louisa, but it was also his statement to the world. Look at what the orphan boy has built. Look at how far the stowaway has climbed. Every brick, every board, every imported chandelier and oriental rug proclaimed the same message. I made it. I succeeded. I am worthy. But having everything doesn't mean you have what you need, and all the chandeliers in the world cannot light up the darkness inside a man's soul. As the years passed, Adolf Coors became one of the richest men in Colorado. His 3 sons graduated from Cornell University and returned to help run the business. His daughters married well and attended the finest schools. The brewery grew larger, the profits climbed higher, and the Coors name became synonymous with quality beer across the western United States. But something was changing inside the founder. In 1916, Colorado became a dry state. 3 years before the rest of the nation, alcohol was banned. Adolf, who had spent his entire life perfecting the craft of brewing, suddenly couldn't make beer. He converted his operation to produce malted milk, cement, and porcelain products made from clay mined in golden. The Coors porcelain division would eventually split off and become Coors Tech, still operating today. Adolf survived Prohibition through sheer stubbornness and business savvy, but it hollowed something out inside him. He watched as beer changed. Pasteurization became standard, heating the beer to kill microbes and extend shelf life. To Adolf, this was heresy. He believed beer should be brewed with care and consumed fresh, not treated like a commodity to be shipped across continents. Mass marketing transformed his beloved craft into an industry he barely recognized. He had built an empire on making the finest beer possible, and now the world wanted cheap beer made fast. The man who had fought so hard to succeed began to question whether any of it had been worth it. By the late 1920s, Adolf's health was failing. In early 1929, he caught a severe case of influenza. His doctor recommended that he travel to Virginia Beach to recover, to breathe the ocean air and rest far from the pressures of the brewery. So in April of that year, Adolf, now 82 years old, checked into the Cavalier Hotel with his wife Louisa, his daughter Augusta, and his granddaughter Louise. They had recently celebrated their golden wedding anniversary, 50 years of marriage. To the outside world, they looked like any wealthy family enjoying a seaside vacation. The Cavalier Hotel was magnificent, a 7-story brick masterpiece that had opened just 2 years earlier in 1927. It sat on a hill overlooking the Atlantic, with sweeping lawns and elegant rooms where each guest enjoyed a private bathroom, still a luxury in those days. Movie stars stayed there. Presidents walked its halls. On Memorial Day weekend of 1929, just weeks after the Coors family arrived, the hotel would open its famous beach club on the oceanfront, a playground for the wealthy that featured big bands and dancing under the stars. But Adolph Coors never saw the beach club. On the morning of June 5, 1929, something happened in room 606 on the 6th floor. Louisa would later testify that her husband woke early, made his way to the window, and without saying a word, either fell or jumped. The hotel workers' scream brought people running, but there was nothing anyone could do. Adolph Herman Joseph Coors was dead. The local coroner, a man named R.W. Woodhouse, made a decision that would puzzle people for generations. He deemed a full investigation unnecessary. No autopsy was performed. No questions were asked about whether the windows had been locked from inside. No real inquiry was made into why one of America's wealthiest men had plunged from his hotel room to the concrete below. Louisa's testimony was accepted without question, even though she was the only witness. The body was shipped back to Colorado by train for burial. In his will, Adolph had made only one specific request. His hotel bill of $1,876.51 must be paid in full. Beyond that, he left no note, no explanation, no reason. Some believed it was an accident, that an elderly man recovering from illness simply lost his balance. Others, including author Dan Baum, who would later write extensively about the Coors family, became convinced it was something else. A final step taken by a man who had become deeply unhappy despite having everything the world measures as success. Back in Golden, flags at the Coors Brewery flew at half-mast. The entire community mourned the man who had put their town on the map, but life at the brewery continued. His sons Adolph Jr., Grover, and Herman took over the business without missing a beat. The mansion on the brewery grounds stood silent, its 22 rooms filled with the echoes of the man who had built it. The German books remained on the shelves. The Copenhagen chandelier still hung from the ceiling. The Steinway piano waited for someone to play it. But Adolph Coors would never return. The years rolled forward. Prohibition ended in 1933, and Coors beer flowed again. The company grew larger under the leadership of Adolph's descendants. The mansion remained on the brewery grounds, surrounded by expanding industrial buildings, almost hidden behind the towering structures of the modern brewery complex. It became known among family members as the Big House, a Victorian relic from another era, its original design and decor carefully preserved as if waiting for someone to come home. Adolph Jr.'s son, Adolph Coors III, was born on January 12, 1915, just a few years before his grandfather's death. He would grow up in the shadow of the brewing empire, never knowing the man who had started it all. Young Ad, as he was called, attended Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, and then followed family tradition to Cornell University, where he became president of the Quill and Dagger Society. He was a good student, a semi-professional baseball player, and despite one quirk, he seemed destined to lead the family business. The quirk was this: Adolph Coors III was allergic to beer. In November of 1940, Ad married Mary Urquhart Grant, a Denver socialite from a respected family. Together they had 4 children and built a life that seemed blessed in every way. By 1960, at the age of 44, Ad had become the chief executive officer and chairman of the board of the Coors Brewing Company. He lived with his family in Morrison, Colorado, in a beautiful home south and west of Turkey Creek Bridge. Every morning, he would drive the 12 miles from his home to the brewery in Golden, a routine as reliable as sunrise. Ad Coors was described by everyone who knew him as quiet, competent, and reserved. He was a good businessman and a good family man. He stuttered slightly when he spoke, which made him even more careful with his words. He had no known enemies, no one who would wish him harm, which makes what happened on the morning of February 9th, 1960, all the more shocking. That morning began like any other. Ad kissed his wife Mary goodbye and climbed into his international travelall, a station wagon, for the drive to work. He probably had his mind on the day ahead, the meetings he needed to attend, the decisions waiting for his approval. The road took him across Turkey Creek Bridge near Morrison, a quiet stretch where the creek ran below and the mountains rose in the distance. But someone was waiting for him on that bridge. A man named Joseph Corbett Jr. had parked a yellow 1951 Mercury sedan in the middle of the bridge, making it look like the car had broken down. When Ad Coors stopped to help, Corbett was ready. There was a struggle. 2 shots were fired. Blood spattered onto the bridge, and then Ad Coors was gone. Around 11:17 that morning, a milkman driving his route noticed a vehicle blocking Turkey Creek Bridge. He honked his horn several times, trying to get the driver's attention, but no one came. The engine was running, the radio was playing, but the travelall was empty. The milkman, growing concerned, moved the vehicle to the side of the road himself. That's when he noticed the reddish-brown stains on the bridge and a hat floating in the creek below. A state highway patrolman arrived at 11:17 and found the registration card on the steering wheel. It listed the owner as A. Coors. He also found 2 hats in Turkey Creek. One was a baseball-style cap that would later be identified as belonging to Ad Coors. The other was a brown felt hat, size 7 3/8, with May Company stamped on the inside band. That hat would become a crucial piece of evidence. By that afternoon, Ad's brothers William and Joseph had been notified. The next morning, February 10th, Mary Coors received a ransom note in the mail. The letter demanded $500,000, $200,000 in 10s, and $300,000 in 20s. The bills had to be used, non-consecutive, unrecorded, and unmarked. The note warned that if she called the police or the FBI, her husband would die. If she cooperated, he would live. But there was a cruel truth that Mary didn't know. Her husband was already dead. The Federal Bureau of Investigation launched one of the largest manhunts in American history, rivaling the search for the Lindbergh baby kidnapper almost 30 years earlier. Agents poured into Colorado from field offices across the country. J. Edgar Hoover himself, the legendary director of the FBI, personally assured the Coors family that they would find the man responsible. He assigned his best agents to the case, men with years of experience tracking fugitives and solving complex crimes. Every clue was examined under microscopes. Every lead was followed to its conclusion. Every witness was interviewed multiple times. And slowly, painstakingly, the evidence began to point toward a man who shouldn't have existed. The investigation began at Turkey Creek Bridge, where forensic specialists combed every inch of the scene. They photographed the bloodstains, measured their positions, and took samples for analysis. They found the 2 hats in the creek below, retrieving them carefully and bagging them as evidence. They examined the travelall for fingerprints, finding Adolf's prints exactly where they should be, but also finding smudges and partial prints that didn't match. The radio was still playing when the milkman found the vehicle, tuned to a station that Ad typically listened to during his morning drive. The engine was still warm, suggesting the vehicle hadn't been abandoned long before its discovery. Within days, investigators had developed a theory. Someone had stopped Ad Coors on the bridge, perhaps by staging a breakdown or some other ruse that would cause a good Samaritan to pull over and offer help. There had been a struggle, evidenced by the blood and the displaced hat. Then Ad had been taken somewhere, possibly killed immediately, possibly held for a brief time before the killer realized the plan had gone wrong. The ransom note suggested kidnapping had been the intent, but the violence suggested something had gone terribly awry. The ransom note itself became a crucial piece of evidence. It arrived at the Coors home on February 10th, just one day after the abduction, addressed to Mrs. Adolph Coors III, Morrison, Colorado, with personal written in the lower left corner. The handwriting on the envelope didn't match the typewritten message inside, suggesting the kidnapper had been careful about certain details while careless about others. The note's language was cold and businesslike, laying out specific demands with military precision. $500,000, divided into exact denominations. Used bills, non-consecutive, unrecorded, unmarked. The warning about calling the police or FBI suggested someone who had studied famous kidnapping cases and knew how they had failed. FBI document examiners studied the ransom note with intense scrutiny. They examined the typeface under magnification, noting the distinctive characteristics of individual letters. The uppercase A had a slight misalignment. The lowercase e sat just fractionally higher than it should. The letter G showed wear on its lower curve. Every typewriter leaves a unique signature, like a fingerprint made of metal keys striking paper, and the FBI's specialists were masters at reading these signatures. They began the painstaking process of comparing the note to typewriters throughout the Denver area, knowing that somewhere, a machine held the answers they sought. Meanwhile, other agents were tracing the yellow Mercury. The vehicle had been found torched in a dump in Atlantic City, New Jersey, deliberately set ablaze in an attempt to destroy evidence. But fire, while destructive, rarely destroys everything. The serial number on the engine block, stamped deep into the metal, had survived the flames. Using this number, investigators traced the car back to a used car dealer in Denver who remembered selling a 1951 yellow Mercury to a man named Walter Osborne on January 9, 1960, exactly 1 month before the kidnapping. The buyer had paid $900 in cash and mentioned something about quitting his job and going back to school. Walter Osborne became the FBI's prime person of interest. But when agents tried to locate him, they hit dead ends. The address he had given the car dealer led to an apartment building on Colfax Avenue in Denver, but Osborne had moved out on February 10th, telling his landlady he was leaving to finish his degree in Boulder. She remembered him as quiet, polite, and punctual with his rent. He had left some possessions behind, including a few cardboard boxes that agents seized and examined carefully. Inside Osborne's former apartment, investigators found traces of a life lived in careful anonymity. There were books about criminal investigation and famous crimes. There were maps of Colorado with certain roads marked in pencil. There were receipts from various mail-order companies for items that seemed odd for a graduate student. Hand and leg irons, handcuffs, a Smith & Wesson revolver. Each purchase had been made under the name Walter Osborne, shipped to the Colfax Avenue address, carefully planned and methodically executed. The most damning evidence came when a document examiner discovered that the ransom note had been typed on the same machine as some of Osborne's personal correspondence. The distinctive characteristics matched perfectly. The misaligned A, the elevated E, the worn G. But who was Walter Osborne, and where had he gone? The FBI's background check on Walter Osborne revealed an unsettling truth. The identity was an alias, the real name of the man who had lived at that Colfax Avenue address, who had bought the yellow Mercury, who had purchased handcuffs and leg irons through the mail, was Joseph Corbett Jr. And Joseph Corbett Jr. was a fugitive, an escaped convict who had murdered before and would apparently not hesitate to murder again. Corbett's background check revealed a man of contradictions. Born in 1928 in Seattle, Washington, Joseph had shown early academic promise. He was intelligent, scoring high on standardized tests and excelling in school. He had been awarded a Fulbright scholarship and attended the University of Oregon, studying pre-med with plans to become a doctor. His future seemed bright, his potential unlimited. But on December 22, 1950, something dark had emerged. Corbett picked up a 20-year-old Air Force sergeant named Alan Lee Reed, who was hitchhiking near Hamilton Air Force Base in California. For reasons that would never be fully explained, Corbett shot Reed twice in the head and left his body in Marin County. Days later, police caught Corbett in Beverly Hills driving a stolen car with a gun matching the type used in the murder. Corbett initially denied involvement, then later admitted to killing Reed, but maintained he had acted in self-defense. In an interview with the San Francisco Chronicle, he insisted he wasn't guilty of premeditated murder and said he would rather shoot himself than shoot someone else. But the evidence told a different story. A jury would have likely convicted him of first-degree murder. On the advice of his father and attorney, Corbett changed his plea to guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years and sent to San Quentin Prison, California's notorious maximum security facility. After serving time at San Quentin, Corbett was transferred to the California Institution for Men at Chino, a minimum security prison where he was supposed to serve out the remainder of his sentence, preparing for eventual parole and rehabilitation. But on August 4, 1955, Joseph Corbett Jr. simply walked away. He vanished from the prison and from the California criminal justice system, becoming a fugitive who somehow managed to create a new identity, move to Colorado, and live undetected for nearly 5 years before deciding that kidnapping a beer baron would solve whatever problems he faced. Investigators later learned that Corbett had studied the Coors family extensively. He knew that the business was completely owned by the family. He knew there were 3 sons and a daughter. He knew Ad Coors Jr. was the old man. He knew the daily route that Ad Coors III took to work. He had scouted Turkey Creek Bridge multiple times in the months before the kidnapping. Several witnesses would later testify that they had seen a man matching Corbett's description near the bridge, sometimes in a gray Ford, later in a yellow Mercury. On January 9, 1960, exactly 1 month before the kidnapping, Corbett bought that yellow Mercury from a used car dealer in Denver, paying $900. He told the dealer he had quit his job and was going back to school. In reality, he was putting the final pieces of his plan in place. He believed he had thought of everything, but even the best-laid plans can unravel in an instant. Something went wrong on Turkey Creek Bridge that morning. Perhaps Ad fought harder than Corbett expected. Perhaps the gun went off by accident. Perhaps Corbett panicked when he realized he had killed the golden goose before collecting the ransom. Whatever happened, Ad Coors was shot twice in the back, and his body was dumped somewhere in the mountains. Corbett drove the yellow Mercury to Atlantic City, New Jersey, and set it on fire, hoping to destroy the evidence. But fire can't destroy everything. The serial number on the engine survived. Meanwhile, Mary Coors was following the ransom note's instructions under FBI guidance. She placed an advertisement in the Denver Post, Section 69, offering a tractor for sale. Signed King Ranch, Fort Lupton. She waited by the phone at the number the note had specified. She prayed her husband was still alive. The call never came. Corbett had already fled Denver, leaving his apartment on Colfax Avenue before dawn on February 10th, telling his landlady he was going to Boulder to finish his degree. 7 months passed. The FBI searched everywhere. Corbett's photo was distributed to police departments across North America and eventually appeared in Reader's Digest, one of the most widely read magazines in the world. In March, the FBI added Corbett to their 10 most wanted list, saying they wanted him more than anyone since John Dillinger. But Corbett had vanished like smoke. Then, on September 11, 1960, a hiker named Edward Lee Green Jr. was walking in the Rocky Mountains about 12 miles southwest of Sedalia when he found a pair of discarded trousers. In the pocket was a penknife bearing the initials ACIII. 4 days later, more items were found: a jacket with 2 bullet holes, a shirt, and then the skeletal remains. Dental records confirmed what everyone already feared. Adolph Coors III had been found. The discovery brought new urgency to the manhunt. The FBI traced the yellow Mercury back to Walter Osborne, which turned out to be an alias for Joseph Corbett Jr. Soil samples from the car's undercarriage contained rare pink feldspar and granite minerals that matched the area where Coors's body had been discovered. The ransom note was traced to Corbett's typewriter. His co-workers remembered him talking about a plan that would earn him over $1 million. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. On October 29, 1960, after 2 Canadian citizens recognized Corbett from the Reader's Digest article, police in Vancouver knocked on the door of a Motor Inn room. The man who answered looked at them calmly and said, "I give up. I'm the man you want." Joseph Corbett Jr. was finally in custody. He was extradited back to Colorado, where he stood trial for the murder of Adolph Coors III. During the trial, Corbett never testified. He never made a statement explaining what happened on Turkey Creek Bridge, but the evidence spoke for him. The FBI presented 23 agents, 5 lab examiners, and a fingerprint expert. The jury heard about the typewriter, the handcuffs, the leg irons, the gun. They saw the soil samples that proved his yellow Mercury had been near the dump site. They learned about his previous murder conviction and his escape from prison. On March 29, 1961, the jury convicted Joseph Corbett Jr. of first-degree murder. Under Colorado law at the time, the death penalty could only be given if there was an eyewitness or a confession. Corbett provided neither. He was sentenced to life in prison. He would spend the next 19 years behind bars, always maintaining his innocence, always insisting he had nothing to do with Ad Coors's death. In 1980, Corbett was released on parole. He immediately violated the terms by traveling out of state and was sent back. Then he was released again, violated the terms again, and went back again. Finally, on December 12, 1980, officials gave him one more chance. He got a job in a factory and later drove a truck for the Salvation Army. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Royal Chateau Apartments in southwest Denver, just 10 miles from where he had killed Ad Coors 20 years earlier. Joseph Corbett Jr. lived quietly for nearly 3 decades after his release. In 1996, He told the Denver Post that he had always been fascinated by the Lindbergh baby kidnapping case, but insisted he had nothing to do with the Coors kidnapping. He worked, paid his rent, and kept to himself. Toward the end of his life, he developed cancer. In August of 2009, neighbors noticed his newspaper lying uncollected outside his door. The building manager entered his apartment and found him. At age 80, Joseph Corbett Jr. had ended his own life with a pistol. He left no note. He died without ever admitting to his crime. Back in Golden, Colorado, the Coors mansion still stands on the brewery grounds, surrounded by towering industrial structures that process millions of barrels of beer each year. The house remains much as it was when Adolf Coors built it in 1890. Most of the 22 rooms retain their original design and decor. The German books still fill the library shelves. The Oriental rugs still cover the floors. The chandelier from Copenhagen still hangs from the high ceiling. The Steinway piano still waits in the music room. It's sometimes called the Big House by family members, a Victorian ghost surrounded by modern buildings, a monument to dreams and tragedy. The mansion witnessed it all. It stood silent when news came that its builder had fallen from a hotel window in Virginia Beach. It stood silent when the grandson and heir was kidnapped and murdered. It stood silent as the decades rolled past, as Prohibition came and went, as the brewery grew from a small operation to one of the largest in the world. The house knows secrets that died with the people who lived there. It holds memories of Sunday dinners where no one spoke. It remembers the laughter of children who would grow up to carry a burden they never asked for. There's a weight that comes with being a Coors. Adolf Sr. built an empire from nothing but could never find happiness inside it. His grandson Adolf III inherited the empire, but lost his life to a man who saw him only as a means to money. Both men are buried in Colorado soil. Both left behind families who struggled to understand how such terrible things could happen to good people. Mary Grant Coors, Ad's widow, spiraled into alcoholism after her husband's murder. The woman who had waited by the phone for instructions that never came, who had hoped against hope that the ransom would bring him home, never fully recovered from the loss. She had been married for 20 years, the mother of 4 children, the wife of a quiet, competent man who had no enemies, and in a single morning, all of that was torn away because a convicted murderer decided that kidnapping a beer baron would solve his problems. The Coors family continued to run the brewery. Ad's brothers William and Joseph split their deceased brother's duties and carried on as if he had never existed. Their father, Adolf Jr., never publicly discussed his son's disappearance with employees. It was the Coors way. Keep your pain private. Don't show weakness. Build your walls high and your doors locked. The same coldness that Adolf Sr. had shown at those silent Sunday dinners echoed through the generations. Today, the mansion is not open to the public. You can see it from Highway 58 if you know where to look, nestled among the pine trees and lawns, almost lost behind the modern brewery complex. Old articles suggest that only family members are allowed inside, though whether that rule still holds, no one outside the family knows. The house keeps its secrets close. What remains is the story. The immigrant boy who stowed away on a ship and built a brewing empire. The mansion he constructed to prove he had made it. The hotel window where everything ended. The grandson who inherited the dream and paid for it with his life. The bridge where a kidnapping went wrong. The decades of silence that followed. Both tragedies share a common thread. Wealth could not protect the Coors family from violence, from despair, from the darkness that sometimes hides behind success. Adolf Sr. had millions of dollars, but couldn't buy peace of mind. Adolf III had security and status, but couldn't avoid a desperate man with a gun. Money can build mansions and breweries. It can fill rooms with chandeliers and pianos. But it cannot shield you from the fundamental vulnerabilities of being human. The Cavalier Hotel in Virginia Beach has been beautifully restored. After years of decline, the property underwent an $85 million renovation and reopened in 2018 as a luxury destination. Visitors can walk the same halls where presidents and movie stars once stayed. They can look out from the 6th floor where Adolf Coors spent his final moments. The hotel is said to be haunted, with guests reporting sightings of a man walking the corridors in the dead of night. Whether it's the restless spirit of a beer magnate or just stories told to thrill tourists, the Cavalier remembers. Turkey Creek Bridge still carries traffic near Morrison. Cars cross it every day, most drivers unaware that on this ordinary stretch of road, a kidnapping turned to murder and changed the course of an American dynasty. There's no marker, no plaque to commemorate what happened. The bridge is just a bridge. But for the Coors family, it's a scar on the map, a place they cannot forget. The Coors Brewing Company survived both tragedies and continues to thrive. The brand is known worldwide. Coors Light is one of the best-selling beers in America. The company merged with Molson in 2005 to become Molson Coors Brewing Company, one of the largest beer producers on Earth. The porcelain division that Adolf started during Prohibition is now Coors Tech, a global leader in technical ceramics. The empire endures, but empires are built by people, and people are fragile. The mansion in Golden stands as a monument to that fragility. Its walls hold the memory of a man who achieved the American dream but found no happiness in it. Its windows look out over the brewery grounds where his grandson once worked before being taken on a February morning and never coming home. The house has seen triumph and tragedy in equal measure, and it keeps standing year after year, a Victorian relic in an industrial landscape. Some stories don't have neat endings. The mystery of what Adolf Coors was thinking when he approached that hotel window will never be solved. The coroner's perfunctory report sealed that truth away. We can speculate, we can examine the evidence of his unhappiness, but we cannot know. Similarly, Joseph Corbett took the full truth of what happened on Turkey Creek Bridge to his own final moment. He maintained his innocence to the end, even though every piece of evidence pointed to his guilt. What we're left with are questions. How does a man who has everything still feel he has nothing? How does success become a prison? How does a quiet morning drive turn into a nightmare? How does a family dynasty survive when tragedy strikes again and again? The Coors mansion offers no answers. It simply stands, weathering the Colorado seasons. Its 22 rooms filled with antiques and memories, its German books gathering dust, its Steinway piano silent. It is both a testament to achievement and a reminder that achievement is not the same as peace. Adolf Coors wanted to prove he belonged, that the stowaway orphan had become worthy. He built a mansion to show the world his success, but inside those walls, he was still alone. And perhaps that's the darkest secret of all, that you can build everything and still have nothing, that you can achieve the impossible and still feel empty, that the mansion you construct, stone by stone, can become the monument to your loneliness. The Coors family learned this lesson twice, 31 years apart, in two different acts of violence that left two men dead and a dynasty forever changed. The brewery keeps brewing, the mansion keeps standing, and the story keeps being told, a reminder that even in America, where dreams come true, nightmares also find their way in.